Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I think the AI meetup in Heidelberg is really a wonderful idea. And many of my colleagues actually have already participated in past events. So thank you very much to the organizers for taking care of this. My talk will essentially consist roughly of 3 parts. First, I want to talk a bit about our lab. Since we are located in Heidelberg, it's oftentimes interesting to find out that, talking to other people in Heidelberg who work on machine learning, for instance, at the university, that they don't know that we actually exist and that we are a research lab. So we have about 80 researchers. Almost all of us actually have PhDs. We are a very diverse bunch of people. We have many nationalities. We always speak English. There is no question about it. We are a research lab, so we don't really work on developing products. But of course, we want our research that we do in this lab to be applicable and meaningful to the company. So NEC is a Japanese IT company and is active in many different areas, ranging from digital health and drug development, something I will talk a bit about today because I'm hoping that some of you have this type of background, ranging to things like intelligent transportation systems and computer networks and many other types of things. So it's kind of nice for us researchers because we can always find interesting ways to apply our research and our output to different areas in the company. And we are actually located, as I said, in Heidelberg, and more specifically in the Kurfürstenanlage at the Römerkreis, in this building that you all might have seen already. I'm working as a chief research scientist in the systems and machine learning group. And if I have to divide our research or categorize our research, I usually divide it into what I would call multimodal learning and reasoning. So we want to combine different attribute types and modalities. So for instance, to give you one example, we might have patient data, and we might have doctor's notes, we might have time series data, we might have imaging data. And one of our goals is to integrate this type of data, and we oftentimes use what's called a knowledge graph to do this. A knowledge graph consists of entities and the relationships between the entities and attributes, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second. And then we want to apply, our machine learning methods that we are developing are essentially applied on top of these knowledge graphs to learn something about the properties of the graphs or the nodes, and again, I'll talk a bit more about this in a second. The second, research area is generally graph-based machine learning. And unsupervised and semi-supervised learning are one part of graph-based machine learning. So there is a way to use graph-based machine learning to do unsupervised and semi-supervised learning. And then finally, we also have a bunch of people, I think, say about 10 people, working at the intersection of systems research and machine learning research. So for instance, machine learning for systems, systems for machine learning, how can we accelerate, for instance, deep neural networks on specialized hardware such as GPUs. This is something that I won't talk about today, but if you're interested in this type of work, please feel free to talk to me after. Now, when we go out and we are talking to business units in our company and to partners in projects, there are several typical technological challenges that we are kind of confronted with. So one is machine learning that works with missing labels and missing features. Verifiable and inspectable AI, so this is especially important for instance, in the medical or biomedical domain. I am avoiding here explainable and interpretable AI because we actually still in our group trying to figure out what that actually means. But what I mean by verifiable and inspectable is kind of the ability to look into the model, at least as an expert, and to understand really what's going on there. I already mentioned that we are working a lot on trying to combine different data modalities. In some cases, of course, we need our machine learning approaches to be efficient. We have started a bit lately to work on extracting and integrating information also from unstructured sources, such as, for instance, text, and to integrate that into a knowledge graph. And then also recently, we have started to look into modeling uncertainty. And I think one of the previous talks, or at least one of the previously announced talks in the speaker series here was also about modeling uncertainty in predictions. Okay, so my talk is about graph neural networks. And so one question is, so why do we even care about graphs, right? So why do you want to use graphs? And so here are some examples of graphs that are in one form or the other used actually in our group. So for instance, we have modeled patients in ICUs as a graph where the nodes are essentially the patients. We have worked with chemical compounds that can obviously be represented as graphs. With protein drug side effect networks where the nodes are drugs and proteins and the edges are interactions between those. And then also generally protein-protein interaction networks. So you can see, and I'm focusing here specifically on biomedical applications because I think this might be more interesting to you, but we have also many other ones where a graph kind of occurs naturally and we want to learn something about this graph in some way or the other. But then there's also this kind of more broader area, which is nowadays called geometric deep learning, where the basic question is, what if our data, so for instance, imaging data, is not located in the plane, in a two-dimensional Euclidean space, but what if it's actually located on a sphere, on non-Euclidean spaces, or what if we have a point cloud? So how can we apply machine learning to these types of situations? And graph-based machine learning is also a way to approach these types of problems. By looking essentially at, for instance, on a sphere, the grid structure as a particular type of grid structure that can be modeled as a graph. Some of you might be familiar with some type of deep learning. Deep learning is, especially convolutional neural networks, have been applied very successfully to image data. And one observation there that you kind of see all over the place in machine learning is that effective representations are often composed bottom-up from local representations. So why is this important? Well, because we can perform parameter sharing. So just imagine the example of moving a small receptive field over an image. We are essentially applying the parameters of this receptive field that we are learning, always the same parameters all over the image. We can build hierarchical features by stacking essentially these convolutional layers. And we have model tractability, both statistically, because we are reducing the amount of parameters that we have to learn, and also computationally, because we have not fully connected networks, but they are sparsely connected. And so the answer in the domain of, for instance, computer vision, how we do this is it's there. So convolutional neural networks are very, very successful used there. But now the question is, what do we actually do when we have an arbitrary graph, right? You can imagine, for instance, an image as a grid graph, where the nodes are the edges are kind of giving you the nodes are the pixels, and the edges are modeling neighborhood between pixels. And so there it's pretty obvious how you can apply, a particular local filter over the image. The question is, what do you do when you don't have such a regular structure? So when you, for instance, have an irregular graph, where, for instance, for different nodes, you might have a completely different neighborhood. So what can you do there? And so this is also kind of visualized here in this particular slide. So again, I'm repeating myself here. For images, we can think of this as a regular grid structure where for every node, so every pixel, we have kind of the same type of neighborhood for all of the pixels. And there it's easy to apply a convolutional neural network by just sliding essentially, a small filter over this image from left to right and top to bottom. And the motivation for the field of graph neural networks is now, what do we do if we have a sphere or a point cloud, a manifold, or some sort of arbitrary graph? How can we also learn local features and build hierarchical feature representations bottom up? And that's largely what our work is addressing. When you look at graph-based machine learning, there's another way to kind of categorize what you can do there. One is learning representations for entire graphs. So for instance, imagine you have a collection of molecules, and now you want to map the graphs that are representing these molecules into a Euclidean vector, into a vector representation, so that you can then downstream learn some sort of machine learning algorithm that classifies, for instance, the molecules into toxic and non-toxic with respect to a particular cell type, for instance. So that's one type, which we call graph classification or graph regression. Then another type of problem is, given a particular set of data points in form of a point cloud or in form of tabular data, we actually induce a graph by looking at some sort of k-nearest neighbor graph. So we're looking in the input feature space, what are the, let's say, 5 closest neighbors to each of the nodes. We are therefore inducing a graph on these data points, and then we apply a graph embedding method that essentially maps now the nodes of this graph into a vector representation that we can then, again, combine with some machine learning method to classify the nodes. So here, for instance, it would be, let's say, you have patients as nodes, and you want to now classify the patients according to their length of stay in the hospital or their diagnosis or whatever. And then, of course, we might also have one big graph as input, either a single relational graph where we just have one type of edges, for instance, a social network, or what we call a multi-relational graph where the edges can have different types. Okay, so again, here the idea is we have this as an input to our problem. We are learning some Euclidean representation of the components of the graph, for instance, edges and nodes. And then we're using this to perform node classification or link prediction. Link prediction means predicting edges in the graph that are not there yet, that we might want to add. And actually, as I will show you now in the following slides, many problems can actually be mapped to these three basic problems on graphs, classification or regression problems on graphs. So again, I already mentioned this before. One example would be drug discovery. So you have a bunch of molecules, you represent them as graphs, and you're learning now a function that maps the graphs into a vector representation, and then you learn a classifier that tells you something about the graph. So when you get a new molecule, you can hopefully say something meaningful about it. Then something, and actually one of my teammates, Brandon, is actually in the audience here. People in my group, and I'm not the expert here, but I wanted to mention it since it's the German Cancer Research Center, are working on using graph-based machine learning for new antigen discovery. Here the idea is that when cells mutate, also the antigens of the cell mutate, and so that's a way to kind of distinguish, hopefully, cancer cells from non-cancer cells. And the idea here is that we use essentially little parts of the antigens, little peptides that are exposed by the cell. We have certain features for each of those peptides. We are inducing a graph based on the sequence similarity. So peptide is a sequence of amino acids. And then we actually perform graph-based machine learning to embed essentially these peptides or epitopes, which is a particular part of this, into a vector representation, a vector space, so that we can then rank these epitopes. And actually here, which I think is pretty exciting, Brandon is actually working with Transgene, which is a company in France, who is actually collaborating with us. So we are essentially developing the pipeline that identifies the new antigens that are good candidates for a vaccine development. And then our partner company is essentially taking these new antigens and is developing a vaccine that essentially teaches the immune system to attack the mutated cells, the cancer cells. So that's something where we are also working on. As I mentioned also before, we are working on patient outcome prediction. So we have worked with patient data of patients in the ICU, where essentially we are also inducing a graph. And we are doing this by using some sort of k-nearest neighbor technique. We are then also embedding essentially the patients into a vector space, and then we can predict certain things about them, such as, for instance, discharge destination, length of stay, in-hospital mortality. So just to give you some basic idea, and one more thing that I mentioned before was we can build a knowledge graph based on essentially where the nodes can be proteins or drugs, and edges between proteins kind of indicate interaction between the proteins, some form of interaction, and edges between drugs tell you something about polypharmacy, so what type of side effects might exist between when you take these two drugs at the same time as opposed to taking them only individually. And then also modeling essentially interactions between drugs and proteins, so kind of by looking at the biomedical literature and seeing which of the drugs are targeting which of the proteins, what's known there. And then we can map this also as a link prediction problem. So we can now essentially, after we have trained the model on this, we can take two drugs and we can ask the model, what are the most likely side effects that you can see here when you that you might see in a patient when the patient takes these two drugs at the same time, right? So which is called polypharmacy. So this is just to kind of give you an idea. So why are we even working on this, right? I haven't been going into the details here, but this is just to give you an idea that kind of graph-based machine learning occurs quite naturally in several domains. And as I mentioned before, I'm only kind of, describing here the work in the biomedical and medical domain, and there are many other domains that we apply this to, for instance, in finance, insurance fraud, and so forth. Okay, so this was kind of more like an overview of what we generally do and why we do it. Now I wanted to also go a bit more into the details, and I wanted to also provide you an overview. I assume that none of you, or only very few of you, are actually experts in graph-based machine learning. So my intention here now is to actually give you kind of an intuition of what people have actually done to learn or to train machine learning models on top of graphs. Not to go into the very nitty, complicated details here, but just to give you a basic idea and kind of a high-level view. And then I also, at the end of my talk, will talk a bit about recent research work in our group, which we have published in this year's ICML, so International Conference on Machine Learning, where we actually learn the structure of the graphs. So you've seen that in some of these examples that I mentioned to you, that I said, well, we kind of induce the graph structure using some sort of k-nearest neighbor algorithm. But the goal here was to say, well, this is maybe bad. We want to actually learn the graph structure at the same time as we are trying to train the classifier to predict something. So we want to actually induce the graph structure while we are training the model. Okay, just one very basic slide so that we are all on the same page. So when I say something like node label or node identifier, I mean essentially the label that's sitting on the node. Node and entities I will use interchangeably. When I say something like features or attributes, I always mean some features and attributes sitting on the nodes of the graph. In some cases, they could also be sitting on the edges, but we're forgetting about this for now. And then, depending on what type of graph I'm talking about, the edges between the graph can also be called relations or relation types. So just to kind of get the terminology straight. So I kind of thought about, the literature in this area. And I was thinking, what is a good way to kind of, summarize to all of you what people have been doing here. I told you in the beginning that, one of the things that people do, and it's very straightforward in imaging, is that you are just moving a receptive field from left to right and top to bottom, right? So like a small grid square graph, essentially, that you're moving over. So what is now the local structure? In imaging, the local structure is this receptive field. So now what could be a good local structure when we actually have an irregular graph, right? Not a grid graph. And there is essentially, when you look at the literature, you can kind of distinguish between three types of approaches. One is where the local structure that we are extracting are triples. One is where the local structure that we are extracting from the graphs are paths or random walks. And then one where the structure that we are extracting from the graph are neighborhoods. So for instance, the one-hop neighborhood. And in all of these cases, so if you wanted to summarize the literature in graph neural networks in one sentence, in one slide, it would essentially be that there are these different ways to look at local structures in graphs. And then the idea is to take these local structures and to map them through some neural network, some differentiable function, some function that has learnable parameters into your target, where you, for instance, now want to classify the nodes, or you want to get an embedding, like a vector representation of the nodes. So this is really what people have been doing. And I will now take a few moments to go in each of the three areas and explain a bit more in detail what people have been doing there. By the way, this is pretty late into the talk, but please also feel free to ask questions, right? So I'm happy to answer questions at any time. Okay, let's look at a knowledge graph. So I mentioned before that a knowledge graph is essentially a multi-relational graph. So the nodes represent certain entities. In this particular case, Barack Obama and some entities, people associated with Barack Obama. Then we have edges, so different types of edges. And the edges are things like is married to, was born in, and so forth, right, in this particular example here. Now, one way to actually represent this multi-relational graph is actually as a three-dimensional matrix. And the way that you can imagine this works is that you can actually represent every fact in this knowledge graph as a triple, what's called a triple. So for instance, you can represent the fact that Barack Obama is married to Michelle Obama as the triple Barack Obama married to Michelle Obama. Okay, so everything that's in the knowledge graph can be represented as a triple. And now because everything can be represented as a triple and you can give kind of a unique integer ID to each of these things like subject, relation, and object, you can now represent every fact that you have in the graph here as a particular entry in this tensor, right? So for instance, if you wanted to know, is it true that Barack Obama is married to Michelle Obama, you could look up here the ith entity, so essentially the ith row, where that corresponds to Barack Obama. You look at the jth, so the column that corresponds to Michelle Obama, and then the relation, so every slice, every depth slice is essentially representing the relationship. And so if there is a value of 1 in this particular case here, then this means that that triple is true. And if it's not in the knowledge base or in the knowledge graph, then the entry is 0. So you can imagine now that it's very easy to represent this knowledge graph as a very sparse three-dimensional matrix, right? And so again, just to kind of refer back to what I said earlier, the local structure that we are looking at here is essentially this triple structure, where we have always a subject, a relation type, and an object. So a triple. Now the idea is like very similar to how you can decompose a matrix. You can also decompose or factorize a three-dimensional matrix. So like, you know, the same way that people, for instance, the same types of methods that people apply in recommender systems, you can also apply here. The idea here is that you first choose a representation, so what is usually also referred to as an encoding of entities and relationships. So in this particular case, we just have essentially a vector representation for entities and a matrix representation for relations. And then we are choosing a scoring function. And this is exactly the function that I mentioned earlier, right? So I always showed you that, well, we are choosing some sort of local structure, in this case a triple, and we are now mapping this triple into some sort of, through some sort of function to learn something. And in the case here, what we are doing, what the function is doing, it's essentially performing a particular dot product between the vector representation of the entity and the matrix representation of the relation, which gives you a vector. And then another dot product with the vector representation of the other entity, which gives you a score, like a scalar, right? And now the loss function, this is step 3, the loss function is essentially saying, for the entries where I know that they are true, so that they are in the knowledge graph, so where the value there is 1 in my matrix, I want that the scoring function is close to it, right? So if the value is 1, I want that my scoring function also has value close to 1, okay? And now what you can do is, once you have trained the whole thing, so essentially you want the function to be good at reconstructing, right, the ones that you already know about in your matrix. And once you have trained the model, now you can ask essentially this function also for entries where you don't know anything about, right? You can ask, should there be a 1 here in this particular position in my matrix? And this is how you can predict essentially links, right? You can predict if a particular triple in my knowledge graph should be true, should be there. Okay, so this is one way to do it. And there are many, many different ways for the scoring function. So there is a vast literature on what's called knowledge-based completion or knowledge graph completion. The idea is always that each of those papers is just introducing a different scoring function, right? So that's the only really difference between all of these papers that are coming out in this area, is that you're choosing a different way of how to combine essentially the representation of the entities and the representation of the relation types to compute a score, that you want to be close to the values that you know are true, okay? So this was, okay, essentially learning graph representations and using graph representations if your local structure is a triple, is a, you know, a triple that represents essentially entities and their relationship. Now another type of local structure are paths or random walks. So I'm sure many of you know that, you know, one notion in a graph is a random walk. So you just start with a particular node and you're just walking around in the graph for a certain amount of time, randomly going to one of your neighbors. And this creates a walk in the graph, okay? And now this is another way of extracting local structure from a graph. So you start with a particular node that you're interested in, that you want to learn something about. You're starting a random walk around it. And you do this for all of the nodes in the graph. And when you do this for all of the nodes in the graph, what you're getting is a bunch of random walks, right? So for instance, if you do this in this knowledge graph that I showed you before, you get random walks of, so if you, for instance, look at random walks of length 2, you get a bunch of random walks, and then one of the things that you can do is you can just keep the most frequently encountered ones. And you say, this is the type of local structure that I care about, right? So if I encounter this type of local structure, I want to learn something about it. And so now, again, we've discussed, okay, this is the type of local structure that we can work with. Now the question is, how does our function f look like that takes this type of local structure and learns, in this particular case, for instance, a node vector representation? And what people have done here is very similar to what people have done in natural language processing. So you essentially treat this random walk as a continuous bag of nodes, like you treat in natural language processing a continuous bag of words. And then you essentially train a function by saying, well, I take the embedding that I currently have for this particular entity, I take the embedding of this particular entity, and now I want to be good, so I send this through a function. I take the average first of these vectors, and I train the parameters of the function, which also include essentially these vectors here, to be good at predicting the entity embedding or the entity in the middle, right? So this is very, very similar to what people do in Word2Vec. And the same thing you can also do for, if you're extracting paths from graphs. And what you get in this case is essentially, in the end, an embedding for each of the nodes. And then you can use these embeddings, so these vector representations of the nodes, to train a model to something about the nodes, right? If you want to, like for instance, in the case of patients. And this is something that, so I'm trying to be a bit also mentioning kind of the first work in each of these categories. And so one of the first works who has done this type of approach is called Deep Walk. And again, I'm not going into the detail here, but the idea is, again, you are extracting these paths, these random walks, and you're treating them as a sequence of nodes, and you are applying essentially a Word2Vec type model to learn the embeddings for the nodes in the graph. So that's the second type of local structure, and what you can do with these local structures, or learn with these local structures to learn node representations. The third type is neighborhoods, and that's the type that people nowadays use the most. So again, here the idea is that instead of doing a random walk, or instead of looking at a particular set of triples in my knowledge graph, or in my graph in general, I actually look at neighborhoods. So I go to each of the nodes in my graph, and I'm extracting, for instance, the one-hop neighborhood of this node. And this is my input now to this function f that I'm using to learn something. Okay, so again, a good way maybe also to think about this is that this is kind of now the receptive field for this particular node. Okay, so you're using, in this case, the one-hop neighborhood and the neighborhood structure as the receptive field for each of the nodes. So they can look quite different. And because they look different, and because for every node in the graph, your neighborhood structure can be quite different. So for instance, even the number of nodes might be completely different. You actually have to find a way to aggregate, right, the information into a fixed size vector representation. So for instance, let's say you take a particular node in the graph, and you're looking at the one-hop neighborhood. For one node, you have maybe 20 neighbors. For another node, you have 5. But in the end, you still want the same kind of dimension, the same vector representation for both of these nodes, right? Because downstream, you want to train the second part of the model, essentially, to predict something for you about these nodes, right? And so again, you have to have some sort of what's called aggregation function that essentially is invariant to the number of neighbors and also invariant to how the neighbors are connected to each other, okay? And so much of the research in graph neural network has been concerned with finding these aggregation functions. Okay. So if you now wanted to kind of unify most of the aggregation functions that have been used in the literature, it's actually quite simple. So in each iteration, so this is again now kind of describing again this function f, right? So what is typically used here. So the input is again the local neighborhood, so the one-hop neighborhood in this particular case. Now the question is, how do we parameterize this function f here, okay? The way that you can do this, and this is hopefully pretty obvious, is that you say, well, I actually do this whole thing recursively. So what I'm actually doing is, in each iteration of my training algorithm, I essentially look at all of the nodes, and I'm collecting, and this is why it's called message passing neural network. I'm actually looking at my one-hop neighborhood, which is kind of here, right? So I'm looking at my one-hop neighborhood. I'm getting the vector representation of the nodes in my one-hop neighborhood. To each of them, I'm applying some sort of function, h here, and then I'm aggregating them. And so typical aggregations could be something like max or sum or some sort of attention mechanism, okay? Then I get, again, one vector representation for my neighborhood, so to speak, right? Because I have aggregated these vectors into one new vector representation. And then I have another part of my function f, which is here denoted by g, which essentially applies to my own vector representation, so the node we are currently looking at, and the previously computed vector representation of the neighborhood. We do something here, and this is now our vector representation at iteration k. Right? And again, I should have mentioned this. What we're doing is here, we are using the vector representation of the previous message passing iteration. Okay? And now you can imagine when you look actually at the graph, like from a bird's view essentially, what's happening is that you're essentially exchanging messages between the nodes. So the messages are sending to each other their vector representations. Some function is applied on these vector representations to then compute the new vector representation of the node that I'm currently looking at. Okay? And then, of course, downstream from that, you have some sort of classification or regression function that is then trained to predict something about the nodes based on the vector representation of that node. Okay? So again, if you wanted to kind of compactly represent what a graph neural network actually does, a graph convolutional network, you have essentially this type of recursion here, which is doing this message passing. Then on top of this, of course, you have a classification function. So the classification function operates essentially at the end when you finish, in each iteration, there is some sort of classification function that, for instance, says, well, I know the label for this one here is cancer, right? So I should predict cancer. And based on that, I compute some sort of loss that I can use now to backpropagate into the model. And of course, I'm also then backpropagating into the parameters of this aggregation function here, okay? And so a graph convolutional network is nothing but a recursion like this here, plus, essentially a loss function that is applied to the nodes in the graph. And in other words, when you look at and think about, so what is actually the input to a graph convolutional network? It is a feature matrix, which essentially just represents all of the nodes, all of the features sitting on the nodes, right? So essentially every row in this matrix might be the feature vector for one node, the input feature vector for one node. And then the adjacency matrix, so the Laplacian of the entire graph. And that's kind of the input to the GCN, and then this type of message passing that I described previously is taking place. Okay, so this is kind of in a nutshell, the different ways that you can learn predictive functions, classifiers and regressors for particular parts of your neural network, and specifically also for nodes. So in many cases, it's applied to predict something about the nodes in the graph. So now I want to shift gears a bit and actually also kind of, and maybe you have noticed this before, also mention a bit that, yes, of course, in some application domains, the graph structure already exists. But in other domains, we have to construct it manually, right? And by manually, I mean applying something like a k-nearest neighbor graph. So let's say you have a bunch of data points and you don't have a graph structure yet. One thing you can do, and I mentioned this before, is you actually say, well, I'm defining some sort of similarity metric between my features of the nodes, and now I'm inducing a k-nearest neighbor graph, right? For every node, I look at the k closest features and their nodes, and then I create an edge there. So we essentially, in these particular cases, and you've seen this in the patient outcome prediction, and you've also seen this in the epitope prediction before, we are essentially doing this using heuristics. So the similarities metric that we are choosing has to be good. So the raw input features have to be also kind of amenable to these types of ideas, right? And also the number of neighbors that you choose. So it's a bit of more like an art. You have to try different things. And that's a problem. And so one of the things that we wanted to do in our work and that we try to accomplish is to actually include the graph structure learning in what's called in machine learning kind of an end-to-end differentiable training. So where you can train essentially a graph neural network like I described before to make some sort of prediction about the nodes, but at the same time learn the structure of the graph, even if it didn't exist in the beginning of the learning procedure. Right? So in this way, you can also apply now graph neural networks to data sets, or ideas from graph neural networks to data sets where you actually don't have a graph, or where the graph was created by certain measurements in the lab, for instance, that have a certain amount of uncertainty. So I know, for instance, this is for sure the case for protein-protein interaction networks. And so again, this is just what I already said. What's usually done is you do this kind of heuristically. Also, many existing unsupervised graph-based machine learning approaches that are very, very popular, something like local linear embedding and isomap, maybe some of you might have heard about them, are essentially doing this. So they're heuristically creating the graph, and then they are learning a node embedding on top of this graph. And this is a problem. And so again, this was kind of the motivation for our work to say, we want to do better than just kind of creating the graph structure essentially manually or with heuristics. And so one of the things that we try to do is we try to actually look at the graph structure as a hyperparameter. So in machine learning, hyperparameter means a parameter of the model that is not part during training, right? So this is something you can think about as the graph structure. The graph structure is usually given to us. If the graph structure is not available, one thing that you could do trivially is you could try all possible graph structures. But of course, combinatorically, that's crazy, right? This is more than exponential. And so it's not feasible to try every possible graph structure and see how well it now works downstream when you apply now a graph neural network on top of it. So that's not possible, right? So we took a different route, and we said, well, one of the things we can do is we can actually learn what's called a graph generative model. So a graph generative model is essentially a model that can generate graphs. So let's say you know that you have 10,000 nodes and a bunch of features on the nodes. You can essentially you can sample from the model in the same way that you can sample from a number from a Gaussian distribution. You can sample from this distribution essentially graph structures. Right? So every time you sample, you might get a different graph structure. But what you have is essentially this compact probabilistic representation of a distribution over possible graphs. Okay? And this graph generative model is parameterized by theta here specifically. And again, just imagine it as a way to sample graphs. Now what we do during training, and this is in the beginning initialized randomly, right? So the parameters of this model can be completely random. So what you do in the beginning, you're just drawing random graphs, right? So on, let's say, 10,000 nodes, what you do is in the beginning is just random graphs. Now what we can do during training, we can actually sample now the adjacency matrices from this model, P sub theta, and use them as training data for a graph neural network. So what we do is we sample graphs from this generative model, and we feed them to the graph neural network to update the parameters of this graph neural network, right? In the same way that I described to you before. The problem here is that the graph generative model here, and specifically the parameters of these models, are discrete. And when you have discrete parameters, it is non-trivial to actually backpropagate, or in essence, it's not possible to compute gradients, because the gradients of a discrete function from which you sample, a stochastic function, is essentially zero everywhere, right? But we have found a way, essentially, and they are now, it's actually a flourishing research area also in machine learning on how to actually backpropagate into discrete random variables. So we found a way to actually backpropagate into both the parameters theta of the graph generative model, so that we can update essentially, right, this model to get better and better. And every time we have updated it, the graphs that we are drawing from this model are getting more and more suitable to the downstream task that we actually are training for, okay? And of course, we can, and this is clear, we can backpropagate into the parameters of the graph convolutional network W, in this case. And again, so the idea is we have a graph generator with parameters theta, we have a GCN with parameters W. We are sampling a bunch of graphs from this graph generator. We are computing the gradients of the GCN, so this is trivial to do, right? The same way that people do it with, like I say, normal vanilla GCNs. But then we are computing the hypergradients. And hypergradient essentially means the gradients with respect to the parameters of the graph generative model, so that we can then use those gradients to update the model to get better at generating graphs. Okay? And then we essentially have a way to update our graph generative model, and we can continue the loop. Okay, so that's the basic idea here. Now, the question first that I wanted to address is, okay, let's say we have a way now to train this and we have finished training. How do we actually perform a prediction with this type of model? Right? Remember that a GCN is essentially a function, and it returns, if you want to, you can say, give me for this particular node, give me your prediction. So what's the most likely class label, for instance, for this particular node, right? But what we now have is essentially a distribution. So, and this is the case if you have just one graph, obviously, right? Like I said before. But now we have a distribution over graphs, right? Because we have this graph generative model. So what we can do is we can just go the Monte Carlo. We can just take a Monte Carlo approach. We are sampling a bunch of graphs from this graph generative model. We are applying our GCN to these sampled graphs, and then we are using an average, right? So we are building essentially a simple estimator based on the results of the GCN on these samples to compute the actual prediction for a particular node, for instance. Okay? So that's the difference, again, to a normal GCN. In a normal GCN, you get just one particular prediction per node. Here, because we actually have a distribution over graphs, we get also, in the end, a distribution over predictions, and we want to estimate, by using a Monte Carlo approach, this prediction. Okay, so how do we actually train this? So we call it latent discrete structure. So how do we actually train this model now? So you can imagine we have a classification loss, right? And imagine now that for each of the nodes we might have now a label during training. We know, this is A and this is B. Let's say if we have a binary classification problem, and so we can compute essentially a loss, right, of the graph convolutional network with a particular set of current parameters W with respect to a particular feature matrix and a particular adjacency matrix. And with respect to the labels that we have in the training data. So why are our training labels, essentially, right? And so what we essentially now, in this case, want to find is, we want to find the best, so to speak, theta, and the best parameterization of the GCN W, such that this loss is minimized. That minimizes the loss, right? So we want to find the best graph generative model and its parameters, and the best parameters of the GCN, again, to minimize the loss in expectation, right? In expectation that's computed over the graph generative model. And the nice thing, and this is something that is one of our contributions in the papers, is now we can actually write this as a bi-level optimization problem where we have an outer objective and an inner objective. So in the outer objective, we have a bunch of, so we're splitting up essentially our training data set into validation and training, right? So we are splitting it up again. We are now, the outer objective is kind of find the best parameter of the graph generative model, the best set of parameters for the graph generative model, such that in expectation this loss is minimal. But we take the parameters of the GCN here to be already, and this is the inner objective, the optimal solution to this particular optimization problem here. Okay? So this is just a simple way of rewriting, essentially. So you can rewrite the objective up here as the objective down here. Okay? What we then do in the inner objective is, this is intractable to solve because the GCN itself is, nonlinear and it's complex. So it's not that you can solve this optimization problem here exactly. So what we do for the inner objective is we essentially just apply stochastic gradient descent. And what this means is that we are essentially sampling adjacency matrices from the current graph generative model, P sub theta. And we are using this to compute gradients and update the parameters of the GCN. So this is the, again, the inner objective, right? So we are updating, instead of solving it exactly, we are moving more towards an optimal solution, or at least a local optimal solution. And what we can then do is we can, in this next step, so this is the inner objective, in the outer objective now. So once we have performed a couple of these steps here, a couple of applications of stochastic gradient descent, we can now update essentially the parameters of theta by using what's called the straight-through estimator. I won't go into the details here, and projected gradient descent, because we can rewrite essentially, so this is the gradient operator here. We can essentially pull this gradient operator behind the expectation, or inside of the expectation, and then this is something that can be estimated at least using state-of-the-art gradient estimators from the machine learning community. Okay, and so in this way we can, again, this is kind of the crucial take-home message here, we can actually compute the gradients with respect to theta, the parameters of the graph generative model. Okay, and this is just again in the whole iterative kind of learning algorithm in a nutshell. I wanted to also say a few words about the graph generative models. So what can we actually use there? So actually in our work we used a very simple graph generative models where we modeled the edges in the graph as Bernoulli random variables, so binary random variables, right? Which has just essentially one parameter per edge. Well, just one parameter per edge can actually be bad if your graph is very large, because the number of parameters is kind of quadratic in the number of nodes. And so we are looking also into alternative ways to parameterize this graph generative model. For instance, there are interesting models from the network. Yes?
Could we also inject a prior belief about how a network should look like?
Yes.
Let's say we know like genetic interaction networks, and we have an estimator from the literature, and we just sort of want to validate and find new interactions.
That's a very good question. Yes, exactly. So actually that's also one of the things that we do empirically, not for protein-protein interaction networks, but for other types of networks, where we essentially assume that our measurements are uncertain, or we purposefully take away some of the edges that we actually know about to see how robust the model can actually compensate for that, right? So that's a very good question. Yes, because in some cases you might have a pretty good idea how the graph might look like, or you might even want to bootstrap the whole thing by using a k-nearest neighbor graph, right? Like I said before, but then actually to train the model to update and to improve essentially the structure, the representation of the structure of the graph. Yes. Yeah, and as I said, there are interesting other ways to parameterize essentially distribution over graphs. And we are currently also looking into using those because we kind of want to get away from this quadratic number of parameters, quadratic in the number of nodes, right? Because the nodes are usually our data points, and this works. We have made this work up to maybe 10,000 data points. If you go higher than that, it gets more and more difficult. Also, I wanted to just, so this is maybe not super important, but one of the things that I thought was pretty impressive is that there are these benchmark data sets. So it's got semi-supervised classification problems. Essentially, you can imagine it's a citation network. You have bag of words, so words sitting on the nodes as features. You have some citations, and now you want to predict essentially the type of paper. So is it a machine learning paper? Is it a paper about cancer research? Whatever, right? And so it's one of those classic benchmark data sets that people use when they apply GCNs. And you can see now here essentially so this is also what I mentioned already before. We didn't just look at the original data set, which would be retaining 100% of the edges. We also looked at cases where we removed essentially a certain amount of edges. And then we applied vanilla GCNs, so vanilla graph convolutional networks. And we also applied essentially our approach by learning now also the parameters of the graph generative model. And as you can see, the difference is quite pronounced, right? So this is, I think, pretty cool. And even when you look at something like we removed essentially here 75% of the edges, we are still doing pretty well and much better than the vanilla GCN essentially here. Accuracy essentially means classification accuracy. So the nodes have labels. For some of the nodes, we don't have the label, and now we want to predict the right one, and we can measure how good we are there. I hope that's obvious. Finally, we also looked a bit at, so what type of parameters do we actually learn? So I mentioned that the parameterization of our underlying graph generative models is essentially every edge is modeled as a Bernoulli random variable. So we have essentially one parameter for this variable, right? And so what we did here is we wanted to check, like, what type of edges does the model actually learn, right? So when we start, for instance, with only 25% of our original edges, what are the edges that are kind of introduced by the model to connect data points? And so one of the things we did is here we looked at essentially nodes that have been misclassified by the vanilla GCN and correctly classified by our method. And what you can see here is essentially that when you look at, so these are just essentially 3 different nodes, okay? And you can see that what our model has learned, so these are essentially probability bins. So it means that this is essentially the density, the normalized number of nodes that have been learned that go to a different class. So a node in the graph that has a different class label. And this is essentially the ones that have the same class label. And as you can see, our method is essentially creating with a higher probability edges to nodes that have the same class label as it is creating edges to nodes that have not the same class label. So it's essentially creating connections between nodes that have the same class label. And then by applying a GCN on top of this, we can propagate this type of information better through the network and predict better the class labels of the nodes for which we don't have them, right? For which you pretend that we don't have them. So this also shows a bit that kind of the probabilities that the model is learning are meaningful. Okay, just to kind of conclude my talk, as I hope I could convince you in many applications, modeling essentially the relational structure, so the dependency structure between data points using graph neural networks can be very beneficial, as opposed to just kind of assuming IID data, right? Identically distributed and independent. The method that I have presented to you in the last part of my talk is kind of like, is similar to architecture search for for like what you see for CNNs, but applied to GNNs, right? So we are trying to learn now the connectivity structure as opposed to learning it between neurons, like in a CNN. We are actually learning it between the data points. And I think this is a very exciting area of research because, as I mentioned, we have proposed this as a possible framework to learn the graph structure, but we think that there are many ways that you can do this much better. So for instance, maybe better gradient estimation methods, better kind of set of tricks to actually allow backprop to work there, better graph generative models like base models, right? I mentioned the stochastic block model as an example. So I think there's also a lot of opportunity for research, and also I think potentially a nice maybe opportunity to learn the graph structure also in for certain biological data, biomedical data, like you mentioned, protein-protein interaction networks. Maybe there's also something that you can learn if you have some sort of downstream task that you want to accomplish on top of the data set, right? Like for instance, predicting the function of a protein or whatever, right? Okay, and with a couple of pretty pictures of graphs, I conclude my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice talk. Do you enforce sparsity of your adjacency matrix?
You mean for the last part, right? So the so here essentially when we learn the parameters of this graph generative model, do we make sure that it's sparse?
Yeah, could happen that your updates of your data just
It's a very good question. Our observation here was, so we were kind of expecting that we would have to do it. What actually happened for all of the data sets that we applied this to is that the values for theta were on average very, very low. So it's actually also something that I don't have here, but we reported in the paper, is when you actually, right, if you have parameters for your theta here, for all of the edges, you can kind of compute in expectation the number of edges in the graph, right? It's just the sum of all of the thetas, essentially. And there, when we look at this, it's staying very, very small. So if the initial graph, for instance, retaining only 25% of the edges had 1,000 edges, then also in expectation, after learning additional edges, we had maybe 2,000. So in expectation, right? We can only talk about expectations. So the increase in the density of essentially the networks that we sampled from the graph generative model wasn't really there too much. So we didn't have to worry about it. But I think in maybe in other application domains or in situations where you kind of parameterize your graph generative model maybe in a different way, this might be something that you have to consider, because it's a good point. We want the graphs to be sparse, right?
And it depends on the task and the application and everything.
That's also a very good question. So what about, which is very common, so why not just connect everything, right? So why not just say, well, which is kind of like a kernel function, right? So for every pair of nodes, we are maintaining some sort of similarity score, and then we are using this in the end. One of the reasons is actually efficiency. So it is much more, so imagine you have a 10,000 node graph. So your adjacency matrix is 10,000 times 10,000. And now if you have entries in all of them, so if it's not sparse anymore, you need, if you evaluate now your GCN, you have to multiply a 10,000 times 10,000 matrix with another 10,000 times 10,000 matrix every single time you do one update. And this is much more expensive than having the graph generative model produce sparse matrices, but maybe producing a small number of them and then evaluating the GCN on the small number of them. Does it make sense? So we have a very sparse matrix, but because we can use sparse data structures, for instance, in the deep learning frameworks, the number of operations to compute essentially the output of our function, of our GCN, and the gradients is much smaller than if we have a dense connectivity structure, right? So that's also one of the reasons why we think this is better. The other reason, and this is actually not in the slides, unfortunately, but we have it in the paper, we did actually compare also accuracy results with what you proposed. So where we actually put in, we essentially maintain some theta for every pair of nodes. And we said this can be non-zero, it can be any value. We're just training it end to end by using essentially a full connectivity structure. And this also worked in terms of accuracy worse than actually using this kind of more sparse representation that we're sampling from the generative model. But it's a good question. Yes.
Just to be even more precise on this, so the input to your graph generator is a pair of nodes, or?
No, so the input, I'm not sure what you mean by input. So the parameters, you're asking about the parameters, or?
You have these Bernoulli probabilities.
Correct.
And they are independent for each
Correct.
possible edge.
Correct.
So you have the complete graph, and every edge has a Bernoulli.
Correct.
That's independent.
Yes.
But to create these Bernoulli probabilities, what's the input to this graph generator network?
So the graph generator is just a probabilistic model. So the input in terms of training is essentially the gradients that are flowing back.
No, I don't mean the Turing prediction. So if you actually want to not to predict these Bernoulli probabilities,
Yes. No, but
you input the nodes which are not yet connected, I guess.
no. Okay. So I should have made this maybe more clear. So what we always have is a fixed number of nodes. So this is fixed in the beginning, right? So for instance, a bunch of proteins, right? And what we are then doing during training is we are learning the parameters. So we are learning the probabilities for edges, right? In this particular case, for all pairs of nodes, right? And then we fix it, and now we can sample graph structures from it, right? Because we can just sample these are independent random variables, so you just sample for every edge, should it be there or is it not there?
These are just constants. They are not functions of the...
Correct, they are just constants, correct.
I thought you would use the raw node attributes to
so
compute.
this is actually a very good point. So this is also something that we are currently working on. You're right. At the moment, these are completely, so the parameters of the graph generative model are completely independent of the raw input features. They are used in the GCN, right, behind it essentially, but they're not used to kind of compute in a forward pass the parameters of the graph generative model. But I think it's a good idea to do this, right, because you might want to have the parameters be informed, for instance, by the words that are attached to the nodes, right? And so this is also something that we are working on, and it's a good point, yes, but in this work here specifically, we didn't do this. They're completely independent, random variables that don't have a particular input, right?
Yeah, this may also explain my second question. If you go one slide forward, in the lower optimizer gradient, I expected to see something like the reinforcement tree.
Yeah, this is...
Reinforced tree,
yep.
instead of the, what's the straight through?
Yes, so this is...
Because they are constants, that's possible, I guess.
No, so...
Why is it possible? Why do you not need the reinforced tree?
Yes, so let's go back at a bit. I wanted to show you a particular here. So whenever you have a term like this, right, and you want to now compute the gradients with respect to the parameters of the probabilistic distribution, you cannot just backpropagate, right? It's not possible, and so that's what's called, gradient estimation. Because now instead of computing the gradient exactly, which is impossible, because the gradient is always zero, right? Because you're sampling a graph, but if you take the derivative with respect to an edge, so to say, if it's there or not, it's zero, right? So you can't use standard gradient computation here. So you always have to use what's called stochastic gradient computation. You have a stochastic computation graph. And one way to approach this is with a reinforce algorithm, right? But there are many others. So that's what I alluded to earlier when I said this is kind of a flourishing area in machine learning, because oftentimes now people realize we want to model discrete structures in our models. So we are getting discrete latent random variables, and if we have discrete latent random variables in our model, we cannot use standard approaches to backpropagate. So we have to use what's called Monte Carlo estimation of gradients. And there are now several different ways to do this. One is reinforce. The problem with reinforce is it has very high variance. So again, because you're doing gradient estimation now, you can now talk about bias and variance of the estimation, right? So the variance is very, very high for reinforce. And usually that's the reason why it doesn't work well. And now people have worked on many additional now, it's a flourishing research area, on other alternative ways to essentially estimate the gradient, okay? And the straight-through estimator is one way to do this. Yeah?
So it turned out to be better for you?
Correct, yes. We tried reinforce, it didn't work well. And we suspect it's because of the high variance.
How large must be or how small can be your data set to get reasonable results in correspondence to other models?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I can only answer this question empirically. We've tried on a bunch of data sets, and the number of nodes is ranging from about 2,000 to 10,000, and there it worked. But I also, I'm sure there are data sets where it doesn't work, right, or where other methods that are a bit more straightforward, let's say, work better. So we used a particular set of benchmark data sets that's commonly used in the literature here. But yeah, it's a bit difficult to kind of make very kind of general, to give you a very general answer to this. We just, applied it to some data sets and there it worked pretty well. But I mentioned this also in terms of the complexity of the approach. At the moment, we are working on improving this, but at the moment, 10,000 is also the limit when it comes to the complexity. So we can't go much higher than that. But we're trying to work on that as well.
Yeah, as a researcher, we are always lacking in data amounts. So therefore, the
yeah.
better it works,
Yes.
small data sets, the better.
So this is my my intuition here is that because we are modeling, right, so usually if you have small data, you might just use it as, you just approach it, you have a bunch of you have a table, right? And you're just training a machine learning model by looking at one row after the other in kind of an IID fashion, right? What we do here is we are also leveraging dependencies between the data points. So we say, well, look, this particular data point here, for instance, this patient has some sort of dependency in the data with this other patient. And so our method is kind of leveraging this. And so one intuition that I have, it's just anecdotal, empirical, is that this is also very helpful if you have smaller data sets. Because you can you have a flow of information between the data points, right, during training, which doesn't happen if you kind of apply the classical IID type of machine learning algorithms. So it's an intuition that I have. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So thank you for your illustrative talk. Let me first try to maybe comment a little bit further on that. So I fully agree. I'm a beginner. I'm a beginner in that topic, but I share this intuition. I think that the performance of your methodology does not only depend on the size of the network and on the amount of data you are given, but also on the kind of informational content encoded in the network. What you named as dependency between the data living on the nodes. Mm-hmm. I think the more, or let's say the less information is encoded in the graph, I guess the better the performance is to get the full structure out of little data. Okay, mm-hmm. But I also have one question. Pretty much at the beginning of your talk, you described that you are dealing with these multi-relation graphs, which have mm-hmm. several types of connections, several types Correct. Of edges. And you also illustrated that by this 3D tensor, yes. Where the types of relations are encoded in their own dimension. Now, when you talked about these graph generative models, you talked about this function which generates adjacency graphs, adjacency matrices. An adjacency matrix does not encode the type of relation, right? It only tells whether there is an edge between two nodes or not.
Correct.
Okay,
so I should say that the last part of my talk was about single relational graphs, so where you just have one type of edge, right? So where it's really, your adjacency matrix is essentially just a two-dimensional matrix. Of course, you could now think about, can we actually extend this also to multi-relational graphs? Then our graph generative model would have to generate, for every relation type, one adjacency matrix, right? Remember that the three-dimensional matrix, the depth was essentially, every slice was modeling a relation type. So now our graph generative model would have to now generate those, right? Yes. So it makes it also much more complex, if it makes sense what I'm saying.
Yes. Either you need to proceed like you just described, if the types of relations are sufficiently decoupled, or if they are depending on each other, you might think of
yes.
An adjacency tensor generator, which kind of gives vectorial outputs rather than just scalar ones describing whether there's an edge or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I understand. So I think you have to model, ideally you want to model dependency, right? Because you can imagine that the capital of relation is highly located with the located in relation, right? For instance, so you want to model for sure dependencies also between the relation types, which wouldn't be the case if we kind of directly applied what I presented here for the single relational case to the multi-relational case, yes. Right? So I completely agree. But even for the single relational case, you also maybe want to model dependencies, right, between the edges. And I think this is, again, just a start. We consider this kind of like a very early proposal of what you could do. I think now it's time maybe to try different to exchange some of the components essentially in this framework that we're proposing to see how if we can do better than that, right?
And modeling probability in just a single type relation case, the thing what you just said in the end, then reconnects to the former question where you said that you are thinking about incorporating this probability thing into the graph predictor.
Correct. Because we are at the moment also not directly modeling dependencies between the features and the parameters of the graph generative model. We are modeling it kind of indirectly, not independently, indirectly, through the kind of the GCN that's coming kind of behind the graph generative model, but not directly. And that's something that I think would also be nice to try. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations. I think you really succeeded in conveying a very complex topic to a big audience without losing too many. So it's like
Well, I hope that's true. I don't know. I haven't talked to everyone, but
good success there. What you said is basically that what your method is really good at is taking advantage of the sparsity in a sense, right?
mm-hmm.
Like during my master's thesis, I worked a little bit with neuroevolution, so basically optimizing neural network topologies. And what I got to learn is that one big problem with meta-optimization is that it just takes forever.
Yes.
What would be very interesting to me is thinking of an example with 10,000 nodes. How much time does it take until the model converges, and what are the computational resources necessary to produce that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's definitely an interesting problem. Yes, as always, so what you call meta learning or whatever, which is in computer science often called hypergradient learning, right? Where you, instead of setting them manually and trying things in a kind of, you're trying to also learn them, like what we do, right? It usually takes a lot of compute, right? Because the space to explore is just so huge. So it also then oftentimes takes longer to converge, and but I think it's an underexplored area. So I think it's interesting for sure. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So just to answer my question maybe a little further, could you give us an example of how much time it took you for one particular experiment, and what your resource stack was, what kind of cluster did you have to produce that?
So we have a GPU cluster in our lab, but for these types of experiments, we essentially just used one GPU, a particular GPU, and it depends a bit how long it took. It depends on the data set, right? But let's see. I think I didn't actually list them too much, but I can go to the.
A day, an hour, a week?
More like a day, maybe, or less. Yeah.
Maybe that's really great. Just
yeah.
a quick follow-up question, for a very non-academic, very pragmatic, low-budget use case, what is a good method to deal with highly sparse but very large graphs, like 10 to the 5 or 10 to the 6? It's
that's a good question. So we for sure cannot do this at the moment, right? So the other types of so if you don't use the kind of learning the structure of the graph, that's not a problem, right? So people have applied some of the methods that I introduced today to graphs with billions of nodes. The problem is more when you do the hyperparameter search or training, so to say, right? So there are existing frameworks out there that do work with graphs of that size. It's just that what I presented in the last part of my talk, it's not there yet, right? You can't apply this to a graph of these sizes. It just won't work.
So when you have high confidence in the topology that it's accurate, then you're good.
Yes.
Such large.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the great talk. I would have a question regarding the application for medical problems.
Okay.
And I think that was the last one slide about the calibration profiles that you showed.
Calibration. You mean in the first part where I presented? Okay. Sorry. Yeah. This is a bit slow. Let's see if I can speed this up.
So my question is that have you looked at the calibration of your model accuracy? Because in precision medicine and in practice, it's really important that you can give a certainty estimate to your class accuracy. And Yeah, and it seems like that's a follow-up question, that your model kind of works like a calibration model. So standard machine learning models have like flat scaling for SVM or whatnot. And your architecture also provides kind of a calibration on top of the vanilla model.
So also very good question. We haven't looked into quantifying the uncertainty, right? That's what you're talking about. It's like how can we say something about the certainty that the model has for a particular prediction? But there is an interesting connection to Bayesian neural networks here. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bayesian neural networks. It's kind of where essentially what you do is you leave. So the basic idea is you have dropout, right, which essentially drops out units in the network, and then usually at test time it's you don't drop anything, right? But if you leave it in at test time, you can actually sample from the network, right? Because every time a different set of units is being dropped out. So you can now sample from the network, and in a nutshell, right, these samples you can now use to estimate uncertainty, right? Because you now get a bunch of samples. And the same thing you can do here, right? Because you have a graph generative model. So you can take a bunch of samples, exactly what I described, right? And we haven't done this, but it's kind of a cool idea. I mean, you take a bunch of, let me go back to the point where, here, right? So in this particular model, we have to we have to estimate essentially the prediction of the model, right? Because we cannot integrate over all possible graphs from this graph generative model. So what we do is we sample, and because we are sampling, we can now also, we have a way to measure the uncertainty, right? So for instance, we could measure how certain is the model actually that the prediction for this particular node is, X. This is a very interesting question. Actually, I mentioned this also in the beginning, that our group is very much interested in that type of work. So, how to quantify this. There are now a couple of ideas, a couple of proposals out there. One is, Bayesian neural networks. And I think there's also maybe something that could be done here to kind of to see, how well you can do there. I think, as far as I know, also, one of the things that people in this community really care about is kind of out of distribution, right? So if you kind of move away really far from your training distribution, in a sense, you really want the model to tell you, wait, you shouldn't trust me here, right? I mean, this would also maybe be an interesting problem here, if we can see that for some nodes of the graph, the model is very uncertain for some reason. But we haven't done this, but it's a very good point. Good question. Yes.
Maybe a bit of an evasive question here, but I still don't quite get the point why you need the generator in the first place. Of course, the empirical results show it's great and all that, but why not just use real adjacency matrices from graphs, but instead generate random, maybe inaccurate graphs?
Yeah, because so this work was kind of motivated by either that you don't have a graph at all, or you have a graph that you assume is incomplete or uncertain. Right. So I agree with you. If you have a graph and this is the graph, right? You shouldn't use that. You just use the standard GCN that I showed you in the beginning, right? So where you kind of assume I have my graph. Yeah. I think you had another follow-up question, or no? Okay. Any more questions? Yes.
Graphception. So you have a graph where a node is another graph. Because then you can say, okay, I have this template of how cities relate to countries, and I just roll it out to all possible cities I have in my data set and stuff like that. Okay.
So the question rings two bells in my head. One is what people have done to learn graph representations, so vector representations for graphs, is that they essentially learned hierarchical features by pooling together nodes. So you can imagine you're applying a GCN and you're learning node representations, so node vector representations. But in the end, you want to have one vector representation for the graph. So what you can do is now you can kind of hierarchically pool the node representations together, and you can learn this end to end. So that kind of over time, right, you're kind of narrowing down, so you're kind of reducing more and more the number of nodes. And every time you apply such a clustering, so it's kind of like clustering, right, because you're kind of merging particular nodes of the graph into one new vector representation. Whenever you do this, you're kind of building this hierarchical decomposition of the nodes of the graph. So that's one. The other one is, and this is also something I haven't mentioned, so what people have done now is the methods that I showed to you in the beginning with based on the triples, right? There the assumption is essentially that my embeddings of the nodes are in a Euclidean space. But when you have hierarchical data, for instance, or tree-shaped data, that's a huge problem for Euclidean spaces. So I don't want to go too much into the details, but just embedding a tree into a Euclidean space so that you kind of maintain the tree distance, so the node distance in the graph, in the embedding space, is extremely complicated, if not impossible. And so people have moved to other types of spaces. So for instance, hyperbolic spaces, where essentially the geometry is more amenable to embed hierarchical data, right? So this is also an area of research in the knowledge graph embedding community, because many of the ontologies and knowledge graphs are in a hierarchical form, where people have worked on. So your question kind of, I get these two associations. I'm not sure if they're exactly what you asked for, but that's kind of, yeah, I'm not sure.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I thought you might say the thing with the pooling, actually. But when you pool everything together, you lose the explicit concept of, hey, this is a template that I reuse from time to time, right? Because you just pool stuff together to get something that works.
Yeah.
I was more thinking like learning, like something explicit on the low level, and then you keep access to that, and then you say, okay, I use this connectivity somewhere else, and you have an explicit instantiation method somewhere in your network, so that you only say, okay, I use this pattern locally, and that forms something more complicated, and then maybe you even get a fractal where on the high level you get the same connectivity, but you already learned it somewhere down.
Okay, so I'm not aware of any work in that direction, but it sounds interesting. I'm also sure I don't 100% understand your question, so apologies for that. But as far as I understand it, I don't know. I don't think this has been done. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I'm very new to the topic, so maybe you can simply point out to some literature, but has there been any approach using like temporally changing graphs?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And could you extend your model to also do that? Because
yes, so there is a lot of work on that actually. For instance, people have looked into graphs that model where the edges essentially model transactions between, like, for instance, financial transactions, let's say, right? And you want to detect fraud in the graph. It's just one application. So yes, people have done this. The problem there is the challenge, right? Is that when you have new incoming nodes or new incoming edges, you don't want to retrain the entire model from scratch, right? Which naively you would have to do. And so a lot of the work is kind of focusing on how can we update the model in an efficient way when new nodes or edges are added to the graph or removed from the graph. Removal is maybe not so difficult, right? Because you just kind of ignore it. But adding also new edges can be challenging because you don't want to retrain the entire model. And the way that these architectures or methods are set up is that they usually, because they're propagating information through the graph, especially the GCNs, it would take a while to retrain the model, right? So but there is literature there. So feel free to send me an email and I can send you some pointers. Yeah.
When we were talking about hyperbolic spaces, am I right? You were talking about something like Poincaré embeddings?
Poincaré embeddings, yes, is one example.
That's why I started thinking when you explained this about a tree that like in many real-life scenarios, graphs comes as a multimodal. You discussed already multi-relational. And from another part of the science, we know that generative models are very prone to mod collapsing. And that's why I started thinking, what are the right ways to define somehow, even the tree, as you described, this is only one mode. you have a tree. Because when you have multimodal, you can do multiple hierarchies at the same time onto the same data. So I started thinking, what are the right ways to define a prior for such kind of hierarchies? What are just promising ideas? It's something like a covariance, the prior on the network structure, which preserve it to be multimodal in a way.
So I think the best literature to look for this is essentially in what I mentioned. So the hyperbolic point Carré embeddings, and the type of kind of inductive biases or priors that they used there. So ad hoc, I don't think I have a good answer to your question. Also, just to point this out, when I said multimodality in my talk, I usually meant different types of features. So, for instance, you have a person, and that person is associated with genomics data, so sequence data, image data, text data. So that is usually what we call multimodal. But multimodal is an overloaded term, so it means different things in different communities. So I understand what you were asking for, but I cannot give you a good answer. No, I can only point you to that literature.
Yeah, I was asking from the side of 2D communications, where we have this similar thing like persons, direction of the call, and telephone numbers. And another basic question about GCN.
Yes.
Am I right that compared to the standard convolutional networks where you have spatial correlations between your pixel metrics, and you cannot just change two columns, and because your picture will change and it will not be the same. But when you apply it to the Laplacian, you can change it.
Yes.
So there is no such thing like a spatial correlation.
Correct, and that's exactly the problem, right? Because you don't have spatial correlation in some, it's not quite right to say that you don't have spatial correlation, because if you have your neighbors are probably more related to you than nodes that are further apart. So there is for sure that, right? But you're right that the adjacency matrix is invariant to particular permutations, right? And the image is not. So there is also that difference for sure. Yes.
I just started thinking because there were similar papers like Water Vector recently, when just some patches of the image were randomly removed, right?
Yes.
And predicted, and some embedding were learned on it. And I just started thinking, is there anything that could also do it in a hierarchical way on the images, because on the images, if we apply graph to the image, we have spatial correlation preserved, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, but
so I don't know. I'm not sure. I think everything I would say now wouldn't kind of be a good answer, so to say. So, yeah.
Yeah, just thinking out.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. No worries. Yeah. Thanks for your question.